Hello, everybody. Hello, Gashman. Hello, the Slurring Scott. Two hellos at the beginning of the stream. And hello, everyone. Welcome. Happy Monday as I'm recording this. You may not have seen it. I posted a video on Friday with the provocative title. What was it? The OSR is dead. Long live the OSR. It was fun. I got a lot of good, interesting comments. I wouldn't say all of them are good, but I always enjoy comments, whether I particularly appreciate them or not. But it got me thinking, and what some of that thinking brought me to was to take a look at the Principia Apocrypha, which I will show on screen in a moment. One of the things that I've seen, not just in some of the comments of that video, but elsewhere, is people saying, when asked about what is the OSR, they'll say, "Oh, it's the Principia Apocrypha." That's not actually what this document, which we will look at in a minute, is trying to do. It is not a document defining the OSR, even though people will point to and say, this defines the OSR. This is a great definition. As we will see, there is a definition of the OSR that they give into it. They pretty much are quoting, I think, Ben Milton from somewhere else. Really what the document is it's, I guess, trying to give out a list of kind of GMing best practices, sort of principles of GMing, what they call in the document old school gaming. And so I thought, well, I had read it, but forever ago. It came out in 2017, so it's not new by any means. And give me 1 second as I open up my Spindrift for today. Hold on a second. Should have done this before. There we go. A sip of raspberry lime Spindrift for the working man. Hey, Ian. Came out in 2017, this document. So it's not new by any means, but it also isn't, it's not like it's a foundational document for the OSR. I think if we want to look back, Osric, which was one of the earliest, I believe, retro clones, a retro clone of AD&D, came out in 2009. So 2017, 2009, there is more time between when the first OSR essentially first was coming out of revealing itself from history than there is between between this document and now. But it's still a really good document written by some excellent creators in the space. So let's take a look. There we go. And I did put a link in the show notes. There are multiple places from which you can download this. It's free if you want to check it out, but I did link to it. If you're watching this on Twitter, elsewhere, you might need to search around a little bit, but if you're at YouTube, you should be able to find it in the show description. So this is the Principia Apocrypha, subtitled Elementary Axioms and Aphorisms on Running and Playing Tabletop RPGs in the Old School Style, from Ben Milton and Stephen Lumpkin, assembled and amended by David Perry, illustrated and illuminated by Evelyn Moreau. And this is just some stuff about the oh, look at that little shout out to Google Plus friends. Wah wah wah. Pour a little out for Google Plus. And then we have some attributions, stuff that's attributed to Ben Milton versus Stephen Lumpkin versus David Perry. We already kind of got that up front. First up, the introduction. Rediscovering the context of old school gaming. Players and GMs newly discovering the old school style of RPG play might lack the historical context that rules designers sometimes take for granted as implicit. Many rules-light games in the old school style don't include much guidance on running the game. I imagine newcomers might feel quite lost, bad experience running or playing them. So I decided to compile some advice, borrowing from the effective, evocative style of GM principles used in Apocalypse World and other powered by the Apocalypse games. These principles are primarily from two sources that are excellent in their own right. Maze Rats, a rules-light old-school style RPG by Ben Milton, and some thoughtful posts and vlogs by Stephen Lumpkin on his blog Roll1D100. These sources are attributed using the symbols noted in the front matter. I've taken some liberty to edit them into a more cohesive whole, giving them impactful titles, as well as expounding on them and adding a few principles myself. So first up is, what is old school style play? A concise definition is quite difficult and subjective, but I like how Ben Milton characterizes it here. Quote, the more of the following campaign has, the more old school it is. High lethality, an open world, a lack of pre-written plot, an emphasis on creative problem solving, an exploration-centered reward system, parenthetically, usually XP for treasure, a disregard for quote-unquote encounter balance, and the use of random tables to generate world elements that surprise both players and referees. Also, a strong do-it-yourself attitude and a willingness to share your work and use the creativity of others in your game. Okay, Rob Brennan, hey Rob, says it's a reaction to the OSR story games tussle that realized that Apocalypse World explicit GM agenda was useful. Yeah, so there's a few things to go on here first, right? So when people say, oh, the Principia Apocrypha is basically what OSR is, well, they're kind of punting here inside the book, simply saying, well, here's a good description, but even inside this document, when asked to actually say what old school style play is, they admit, and they're not trying to be, they're not trying to take on the kind of stature and I guess authority that I think people are giving it afterwards. But even here, a concise definition is quite difficult and subjective. People have been arguing about this since before 2017 when this was written, and of course have continued to argue about it and waffle around on it afterwards. But per Ben Milton, the quote from Ben Milton here, I don't disagree with any of it. I think those are all good things when you're trying to think about what something old school is. But of course, the thing is here is even maybe post 27 or maybe even during this time, right? I think there's probably even been some division between OSR and old school style, probably primarily because the OSR as a brand, a label, a thing has continued to expand. Whereas I think what we consider old school style has kind of stayed the same. Like, I don't think anybody is really I don't think there are any arguments about if playing old school style that this is what it is. Though some folks might start to, I think if you then characterize as, oh, this is OSR, some folks might start to now raise some points or counterpoints or whatnot just because of the way the label OSR, as I tried to kind of talk about from the video that I think I put out on Friday, there's how that is kind of morphed into tons of different things. But in terms of old school style, which is kind of what they're talking about here, OSS, if you will, I think that's a good list. Though I guess one other thing that's come up that's interesting is as I had posted my video, even before I'd posted that video from Friday, and that is the OSR is dead video. Looking on Reddit, people were even arguing with some of the things that we'll get into here, not so much because they don't think they're useful, but in terms of their accuracy, as far as, I guess, going back to that OSR versus actual old school, like the kind of, in a sense, idealized qualities that are laid out in quotes like that about old school style and the folks' actual experiences of old school style being different. And I remember running that a couple of times at Reddit where someone was saying, hey, I was looking up at these, at either this document or some other, I think Matt Finch's document or other ones that say essentially the same things regarding old school style and saying, hey, that doesn't actually jive with how I played back then. And I think that's because a lot of what these documents are taking is and what the OSR kind of in general was doing, especially earlier on, was kind of idealizing the things that folks liked most about certain versions of old school play, which is why I think that Basic Expert as a version of the rules became a lot more prominent in OSR than it was back in the day, when I think a lot of people's experiences was, oh yeah, you start in Basic Expert, then you move on to AD&D, so on and so forth. And though they tried to reboot it a couple times, and I don't know about sales numbers, but I would imagine my impression from being around back then as a kid anyway was that AD&D was way more popular and way more present in terms of play and friends and just getting games together and just how we were playing the game than BX was. Even though I, in retrospect, love BX more, I think like a lot of folks went from BX and kind of mashed it up with AD&D and things like that. Whereas from the OSR standpoint, BX has a way more hallowed, vaunted position than AD&D does, which is another thing that doesn't really jive with folks who maybe have experienced it firsthand and are coming back to the scene and wondering, well, why is AD&D sometimes treated like the kind of ugly stepchild, when in reality that was kind of the system that dominated the time for the most part. Anyway, back to it. These elements were present in the early years of the hobby. At first, they may seem crude, cumbersome, or outdated, but many players find the kind of gameplay that emerges from these elements very compelling. They can evoke creativity, engagement, wonder, and a sense of accomplishment. The appreciation of old school style play shouldn't be misconstrued as chasing a sense of nostalgia. This can be true for some, but an increasing number of players who enjoy the style weren't alive when these rules were popular. And beyond simple retro clone and rehash rule sets, there are many elegant modernizations, reinterpretations, and entirely new and innovative rule sets that foster this style of play, and even more that permit it. And then we've got some links. I'm going to skip the using the principles. Hey, use them, it's basically that, hey, your miles may vary with this stuff. Let's see. Rob Brennan says BX has greater global sales as it was more often translated as far as I know. Okay, that's cool. That's interesting. Because yeah, I mean, my perspective is definitely the American RPG scene perspective and not what it may have been like elsewhere on the planet. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. The OSR and the cardinal principle. The quote, old school renaissance, unquote, or OSR, is a scene and community, or many overlapping sub-communities, of people who enjoy the old school style of play. As with any other community, it's composed of all kinds of folks sharing ideas with one another. Inevitably, some of those ideas will be strongly held opinions. No joke. Some people have louder voices, and some are deliberately provocative. Drama, miscommunication, conflict, and harassment can and will happen. And as with any other community, it's up to all of its members to foster and maintain a healthy environment for themselves and newcomers. But when it comes down to it, remember this cardinal principle: your table is yours. And I'm not going to read the whole thing under your table is yours. I mean, it's, essentially, right? Whatever everyone else says, what works for you and yours is what works for you and yours, and you should do that. And ignore the people screaming and clamoring about one true ways or what's right or what's wrong or what is OSR or you're not OSR, or you're playing it wrong, or you're doing it wrong. None of that stuff really matters in the end, because ultimately, whatever you're reading about or learning about or doing on the internet, you're taking to play with your table of players and yourself. And whatever works for you works for you. And whatever everyone else may say or say works or whatever, right? That all pales in comparison to your actual practical experience in your game, specific game. A little swig of Spindrift. Now we're on to maybe the first of the GM or referee principles. I think, right? That I didn't skip anything, did I? No. Be an impartial arbiter. Rulings over rules. The primeval old school principle. Old school games are often sparse in what situations their rules cover. They are often minimal or no skills or feats. This is a feature, not a bug. The flexibility this openness allows is a big part of the appeal of old school style games. Let players take advantage of this openness to try crazy things and apply logic to taste. When you encounter a situation that the rules don't seem to cover, don't get distracted searching for it. Instead, make a common sense ruling within the spirit of the game and move on. It doesn't have to be perfect. Later, if you find there is in fact no rule and it could come up again, make a note of the ruling and apply it consistently. So the maybe the two things to note here is this isn't actually saying necessarily rules light, which I think is important because I think that trips a lot of folks up in terms of where, say, something like AD&D or other role-playing games that are fairly rules heavy exist within kind of the OSR, old school style, or whatever you want to call it. But it's simply saying that go within the moment, keep the flow in a sense. Don't get caught up looking for a rule. And then generally speaking, even in something like AD&D that has a lot of rules density for some things, it doesn't have a bunch of universal mechanics that you're supposed to apply. It's all these different situations, but outside of those very specific situations, it's kind of gives you sort of the, hey, you do it. I remember BX in its kind of referee section would talk about, hey, there are different roles you can use. You want to use X and 6? Great. You want to use roll under attribute? Great. If you just know some arbitrary number, like, I think you have a 9% chance of success, then roll a D100 and use that 9% chance of success. In other words, use kind of whichever one of these ways or on some other way works for you. And I think this piece of advice or this principle is kind of getting to that. And also, don't, you're in the game, even if you have the AD&D DMG in front of you. I actually have mine. I was looking up something before. Don't get caught up trying to find that rule. Just come up with something that kind of makes sense. And if it doesn't exist, then, maybe write it down and you can use it for later, or you could fix it for the next time if it seems too harsh or too not harsh enough or whatever, but just kind of do that and move on. And I think not only just doing it, but I think developing the confidence as a referee to kind of, get that, just put that ruling out there and kind of saying, hey, we're going to live with it and move on. I think helps. And as you develop that, your players will start to kind of trust in you. And definitely, I think a dialogue is part of that, but then you can just kind of keep the game moving. And I think that's kind of the idea, essentially, is keep the game moving. Don't worry about it. You don't need to don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Keep it moving. Next up, divest yourself of their fate. As GM or judge or referee, perhaps more appropriate for old school style games, you are not an antagonist to the players or characters, nor are you an author writing their story. Portray the world and embody its denizens genuinely as they would react to the character's behavior. Don't set out to tell a story. Let one emerge from the character's interactions with the world. I think it's also good advice. Certainly, it follows my kind of approach, though. We have to let it be said, it's it's not like there weren't tables that really enjoyed antagonistic approaches even back in the day. There were even looking at Gygax himself with was it Tomb of Horrors essentially being a reaction, a meta reaction to players saying, "Oh, we're so great, we're so awesome," and Gygax going, "Oh yeah, well let's see how you handle this." I mean, that is essentially an antagonistic place for which to create an adventure, but still, I'm not saying it. You shouldn't have done it. It's great, it's fun, it's in its own way, but certainly there is that idea of like, "Oh, I'm going to show you" kind of thing, which is antagonistic. But I think ultimately the idea here is that we're supposed to take things and just play it out. I'm not looking to destroy you. I'm just playing these monsters the way you play. And I think once you get you and your players, if you can get on that kind of same page, I think it does take a lot of the pressure off. Because if the party realizes that whatever the bugbears are doing, the things that make sense for the bugbears to do, then there's less upset when maybe the bugbears win or something happens or the party loses out or something happens, right? They don't think like, "Oh, the GM was out to get us." It's like, no, that's what the bugbears would have done, so they did it. And then it's easier to kind of let go of some of the things. I think in modern games, with the approach is me as kind of hero of the tale and everything else is kind of in service to that, can feel a lot more frustrating. Be fair and impartial. Do not fudge rolls and avoid rolling in secret. This keeps the game honest and dangerous and prevents any accusations of favoritism or railroading. It also encourages the players to manipulate and engage with the fictional world rather than with the GM. So the arguments with fudging and not fudging everything have been around since the game's been around. But I'm not a big proponent of fudging. I mean, I think there's always that edge case where you look in and say, "Oh, well, maybe," but then I always think, "Hey, but then where does it stop?" I always think of that slippery slope. If I start fudging here, when do I stop? And I think the other thing, just to go off on my own tangent, is I think sometimes often the excuse for fudging for a lot of folks comes down to, "Well, I don't want it to happen this early, or I don't want it to happen with new players, or I don't want to do this or that." But then on the other hand, I think those are fair. Okay, yeah, we don't want this to happen to new players. We don't want this to happen at the beginning of our game. But by the same token, this is what the game is. And I think sometimes just letting somebody see like, "Hey, here's the game in all its glory." And part of that is this kind of lethality, let's say. If I save you from it, you're not really playing the same game. And then when do I introduce it? And I think sometimes just being upfront is part of that session zero, and then saying, "Look, you very well may die. This thing may happen to you. Let's get it out of the way early, and then you're used to it, and then you understand the game." Whereas I keep holding off, and it's like, well, when can I bring it in? I think the more you get attached, the more you think you understand the system, but it's not really the system because I've been kind of having you on rails, but you didn't know it. Then I got to try to introduce it later. That just seems like to me, just rip the Band-Aid off, so to speak. Terrence says Gary's group effed around and found out. Or from what I heard, at least with some of them, they effed around and then hired an army of orcs to find out. But yeah, pretty much. Leave preparation flexible. Don't prepare a plot for the players to follow. During the game, observe how the players deal with the situation and extrapolate the effects of their actions based on what you know. Don't plan the results too far ahead of time. Players rarely do what you expect them to. Don't overdo the preparation. Keep your situation ideas loose enough that they can be adapted to the PC's choices and flow of the game. Remember that unused prep can always be recycled in later sessions. After each session, ask the players what they plan on doing next and prep a few situations related to that. The direction of the game should be guided by the players' decisions, not the GM's. Some RPG products are more like toolkits than source books, helping you adapt and build a unique, flexible setting around your players rather than being restricted to a rigid, dictated instance of someone else's. Yeah, I mean, again, more good advice. The kind of prep stuff, I think it's good advice regardless of the game you're playing. And I think that's going to happen. I think we're going to see that. I think we've already seen it. We're going to keep seeing it here, that some of this advice isn't particularly like, "Oh, the old school style." It's it's more a I don't even know what kind of style I would call it. It's because look, back in the old school, there were people who, I mean, this is the kind of the thing, right? I think we end up in that idealized version of what it was like to play back in the day, and that experienced in the experience of playing back in the day, because I had GMs back in the day that did tons of prep. It wasn't like, oh, back in the 80s people played, nobody did, everyone was super efficient and only prepped these things and didn't have stories and all this stuff. Like, it's not true. These arguments or these tensions, let's say, between sort of the open scenario, let the players control it style, and the GMs kind of feeding people along a sort of a module style, has probably been going on at least since the early to mid 80s. I mean, kind of when they started to take the turn from that kind of original, like, hey, you're just kind of in some big map, to we're playing adventures per se. So this is not new, and it's certainly not something that's universal. But I think looking back and formulating this through this renaissance or revival, it's this more kind of idealized, at least one branch of that, and then idealized. It's kind of like, what if we went back to when the modules were more like, Keep on the Borderlands and Isle of Dread, and not so much like maybe Dragonlance or Ravenloft, or the more really linear modules. And let's see kind of what it was like in that era, and then do that. But the old school experience was a lot broader than that. But this is that ideal sense. Slushbub says that they were tempted to fudge in session 1 of their first ever old school essentials campaign. They didn't, and a PC was killed by a trap. Good way to set the tone. It is a good way to set the tone. I think that's the kind of the thing, right? I think sometimes, what do they say about kids? You don't really get fire until you burn yourself, and then you understand it. And I think really for players, it's that, yeah, you F around and you find out. You put your hand in the fire, you get burnt, you go, oh, okay, this is a real thing. And when you keep protecting them from all that stuff, I think it just leads them to go down this path of, am I invulnerable? Like, does it matter what I do? Can I do whatever? And we want them to do whatever, but they also want to understand that, hey, actions have consequences. And I think the earlier you hammer that into them and they get it, the more, I think, on the same page and fun the game will be. And yeah, if it happens in session 1, at least they haven't gotten super attached with their characters. We hope. Build responsive situations. Establish situations with several actors or factions pursuing their own ends. Let the player's actions affect this environment, and let the consequences affect the players in turn. Show the situations worsening if the players don't address them. One way to create interesting situations is to draw a grid that maps the relationships between the elements of a situation and how they relate and interact, or how the party might intervene. Yeah, this is kind of like fronts in sort of your apocalypse, powered by the apocalypse type games, or I'm trying to think what other games have come up with it. I've talked about it. You want to sort of map out these factions. It makes a helpful situation. Some, depending on what kind of, if I'm trying to link this back to kind of old school, and say in the Keep on the Borderlands, there's really just the one faction, or I guess there's two, but there's sort of the Keep faction, and then there's the Agents of Chaos faction. There's not a ton of interaction. There's a little bit that's implied that I know some people have taken and run with, which is really cool, but ultimately it's just kind of there. And I suppose you could say that each of the individual groups of denizens in the caves is kind of their own faction, but that's a lot to sort of run, but they have their own goals and whatnot. But I think there's definitely, again, part of that kind of idealized, I think, looking back and really taking more modern principles that we were injecting into this old school style, is this concept of having these different angles that you can take. Okay, these guys want these things, and then we can kind of work with them. And these guys want these things. I mean, maybe in more the, I'd have to go back and read more. I know that it's, if you go back and read something like some of the stories from Blackmore, there are different powers that work doing things, but I don't know if they exist. I feel like they were more in that kind of political scene, and not so much that folks interacted with on a session to session basis. But I might be wrong, because I don't, my understanding of how in specifics how Blackmore was played, not particularly, I wouldn't say I'm expert in that, in anything. And in any case, it's a great thing to try to have, because when you have factions, it gives you as a party, it gives you angles. And that means that you feel like, one, the world will feel more dynamic. Two, it feels like you can do a lot more. Three, kind of maps better to what we feel like of in our own world, with different groups and what they want and what they need. And in just in popular culture and fiction, there's always that concept out there of whether it's the Man with No Name, Clint Eastwood, in A Fistful of Dollars, finding two factions basically to stalemate and trying to work them against each other, or in any case where somebody's in that gray area between law and order and they have dealings with the underworld, but also dealings with the cops, much like in like a film noir might. Like I think of like a Marlowe story, or something of that sort. Embrace chaos. Listen to that capricious muse, the dice. Relying only on your own imagination can become exhausting and predictable, and can feel less like a concrete world to the players. And external inspiration and random results help you divest yourself of their fate. Use random tables to keep the game fresh. The surprising twists that random tables add can bring an energy and mystery to the game that is hard to improvise. And this is maybe one of the big things that certainly old school style games separates them from, say, modern games, where I feel like when I read a lot of modern, or I go to Reddit and I read a lot of 5th edition forum or subreddits or posts, a lot of times people will, even if tables exist, will be like, I don't want that. I don't want random. I'm going to craft these my own. And I always like to think it's, one, they're random as you generate them. Doesn't mean they appear random in the world. That's where you as the GM interpret the results so that they fit the context of what's going on. But it also means that, I think you're losing the source of imagination. You're using the source, or so I should say inspiration, because your imagination can run dry, or you can end up in a rut because you've been thinking about the same thing over and over again. And the dice are this nice injection of an unknown that can help lead you to just different ideas. And kind of, I can't even count the amount of really fun and stuff that's come out only because I rolled dice as opposed to just going with what my brain was on my brain. But uphold logic. But don't use random results to the extent that the world feels nonsensical. If there's an obvious choice, consequence, or cause, use it. This can help maintain verisimilitude and let players make reasonable plans. It also emphasizes the surprise and intrigue of the instances of randomness when you do use them. You might also customize random tables to give a more cohesive feel to your game setting. I think that makes sense, right? The setting should feel coherent. If things are starting to lose that coherence because everything is just, you're rolling on tables for everything and running with it, then you're probably doing it too much, unless that's your intention. Let them off the rails. Feel free to let them know where most of your prep is, but if you expect them to zig and they zag, don't constrain or reroute them. If you don't know what comes next, let random tables fill in the blanks. Then build on it between sessions. Find the excitement they see and embrace, too, the chaos of the players, which is pretty much similar to that. Be flexible, right? So you're flexible, your prep is flexible, your mind is flexible, you're open to anything that the players may do. If they decide to go, one will go left and you thought they were going to go right, then don't push them right. Just figure out using whatever tools you have, aka random tables and whatever other things to kind of get it going. Ryan says verisimilitude party. Absolutely. It'd be interesting to count if they say it a bunch of times. I don't think they are. I don't think this is going to be one of those where they're going to be touting verisimilitude at every turn, but we'll see. So the next chapter, if you will, is get them thinking. XP for discovery and adversity. Many old school game styles directly correlate XP earned with the value of treasure returned to safety. This is a convenient abstraction of the characters learning from the exploration and adversity of retrieving that treasure. XP may also be granted for defeating monsters, but that doesn't necessarily mean killing them, and the XP value is usually much less than that of the treasure they guard. This incentivizes players to outthink monsters instead of defaulting to violence. XP for treasure is like the fuel of the game's engine. Player decisions almost always hinge upon it. It's also an effective control knob. By adjusting the amount of treasure available, you can control the rate of PC's leveling. And you can tailor the focus of your game by adding value to exploring wilderness, saving prisoners, acquiring books, artisanal brewing ingredients, crystallized memories, etc. Yes, this is basically, using XP for treasure as your base. Something like, I guess, really, definitely the white box, BX. I don't know if AD&D. I'm not gonna spend time. I don't remember when it really shifted to XP for combat, when that happened, or that became the 4. But yeah, I mean, think about in your game. As I mentioned before, whatever your games, whatever you want your players to be doing, or whatever you guys decide your players will be doing, figure out ways to incentivize it in a player-facing way through experience. So if you want to play a game of, hey, we're explorers, we're going to be on ships or on land exploring and trying to map and find new places, then you can easily make that your experience. I myself much prefer that kind of player-facing sort of objective, in a sense, experience than milestones and stuff that I think end up becoming super objective. subjective in the sense that in a milestone, then I kind of decide what's enough when they've earned it, sort of thing, which I don't like at all. Versus, hey, we need to get this much experience. Either that's this many hexes or miles that we've covered, or finding this many landmarks, or like they say, finding artisanal brewing ingredients, crystallized memories, whatever. And then I can just use tables and whatnot to essentially make their presence in the world more or less out of my hands, or it becomes distances traveled, which is more or less out of my hands, that kind of thing. I like that. Player ingenuity over character ability. Old school PCs are very minimalistic because the character sheet is mostly there for when players make a mistake. Players are not meant to solve problems with die rolls, but with their own ingenuity. Therefore, present them with problems that don't require obscure knowledge, have no simple solution, but have many difficult solutions. Examples: cross a moat full of crocodiles. A door in a deep dungeon only opens in sunlight. Retrieve a key from a lake of acid. And this is really getting to engage. So a lot of times I think in more modern games is we often, I say we, GMs will say, oh, the players, or maybe we lament characters always looking on their sheets. But I think we do the same things when we're coming up with puzzles, and we say, okay, or in this case, a situation. When they don't call it a puzzle, which is good. Let's see, what do they call it? Problems. There's a problem needs solving. We'll look at it and say, oh, this needs a DC 20 acrobatics check. Well, all we're doing with that is encouraging players, or in our own, even if we don't say it outright, we're kind of implicitly saying characters, okay, just find the right skill and then apply it. Whether we ask the player to actually say, I use my acrobatic skill, okay, DC 20 roll, or we want them to say, I make a somersault in the air, aka make an acrobatics check. Whereas in the kind of old school style, it's, well, you don't have any of that stuff. You don't have an acrobatic skill. You don't have anything. So you more or less need to come up with some other way, because we don't have that one mechanism you can call it. So now you have to think about, okay, well, with the moat full of crocodiles, I can't just look at some skill. I gotta figure it out in the fiction. Now, that's not to say that even in the presence of skills, you can't do that. And I think, like I said, I think a lot of this advice is applicable whether you have skills and those kinds of systems or you don't. And certainly some old school games, had skills in them. Certainly second edition AD&D started to add skills, and I think there was some kind of skill system in somewhere in the BECME and the rules encyclopedia. So it's not like they, at no point in kind of old school were there skills, but the idea of having the players really work through in the fiction how they're doing it, and you as the GM being open to all of it, whether it's, I don't know, using grappling hooks and rope and then swing across like you're playing Pitfall on the old Atari to get across, or whether you go back to the forest and you cut down logs to make yourself your own little bridging action to get across, or something, you tie them to bolts and you try to fire them into the masonry of the castle wall, and then you're going to, balance your way across like you're a high what is it, a high wire act, whatever it is. You can do it. Brian Smith says the formatting on the ask them how they do it got me scratching my OCD head. Yeah, so if you happen to be listening to this at some point later, the next heading on the page is ask them how they do it, and each word is on its own line. I'm not sure why they did that. I think it's just for the page, because there's no graphics here. So I think instead of having either a big gap between, basically to keep the typography consistent and not have big gaps anywhere, that's why they did that. But yeah, it is. So ask them how they do it. Encourage players to interrogate the fiction of the environment manually, asking them to describe the manner in which they interact, rather than eliding their actions via roll or assumed character ability. You can always grant them a roll for discovery or insight if they give up. And this is essentially that rule of don't ask me what to roll, tell me what you do. Like you'll find this more often, again, in your sort of skill-based games. Someone might say in a game, say, hey, can I roll acrobatics to jump over this? Or, can I roll athletics to jump across this moat? And, use the GM, say, don't tell me, or, or maybe more likely a player says, I use my athletics, jump across the moat. And then as a GM, you go, don't tell me which roll you're going to make. You tell me what you do, and I'll tell you which roll you're going to make. So then the player might come back and say, okay, I take a running start and, plant my foot as my jumping off foot as close to the edge, but not over the edge at the near end of the moat as I can. And I leap across, and then, all right, try to leap across. And then the GM goes, okay, give me that acrobatics check or strength check or whatever throw you were going to roll. Let's see. Stochastic says it's for emphasis. I'm not sure if it is for emphasis, actually. I really think it is more just because they want to space everything out on the page. But because no particular word gets more emphasis than the other. I mean, it's supposed to be ask them how they do it. I don't know. Not a big deal. Hey, Perkins. Glad that you made it to the stream live this time. Doopy Dog says, I like low magic Dungeons and Dragons worlds. I do too. I guess I like my magic weird and not everywhere. So I guess that's low magic. I feel like there can be high magic in places, but I'm not so much a fan of kind of the Harry Potter sort of magic is everywhere kind of thing. I like it weird and strange and uncontrollable and not so sort of tamed, maybe. So Catholic says, Powered by the Apocalypse asks, what's that look like? Yep, that's a good phrase. I do think I covered it a long time on the stream. I think some of the GM advice or the GM facing stuff from the Powered by the Apocalypse. It's worth a read, regardless of what you think of the system overall, whether you want to use it. There is actually some good advice, and that's kind of where this book is coming from, is really sort of looking at making an OSR type version of that kind of advice. Like they said in the intro, oftentimes with a lot of OSR products, you don't get much. And so people might come to it and be confused. And this is kind of filling that gap that's there. Let's see. The Principia has great ideas, Perkins says. You need to enlist your players and have them read this PDF too. Yep, I definitely think that this is good to hand over to your players if you're going to be running a game. It is geared towards GMs, but there's a lot in here that there's the expectation that players are going to be aware of these things. That's kind of the other part of it. It's sure GMs need to be aware of all these things, and this is good advice for things they should be aware of, but they also have to make their players aware of it. And you could just do that by having them read this. Absolutely. So a really good idea. Let's see. Snoopy Dog says, kind of like Lord of the Rings. Yeah, Lord of the Rings is definitely one of my touchstones. And it's definitely, I know there's definitely a generational difference with things, right? Just in terms of what books are those touchstones. For me, it was stuff like Lord of the Rings. And for folks who are younger, I think of like my daughter who's 8. But even folks who are a good deal older than her, their touchstone may be Harry Potter, which is going to give them a definitely different vibe of how magic acts and reacts. So I can see why, for me, the 5th edition kind of cantrips that are basically like your kind of lasers that you're able to do over and over again don't really feel right to me. But from someone used to the Harry Potter style, it seems right, because that's how kind of magic is deployed there, right? So let's see. Slushbub says, it was difficult to break my players of wanting to roll perception checks every time they walked into a room versus saying, I look under the bed. Yeah, and I think that's why oftentimes I've found that it's easier with totally new players. You don't need to break them out of habits from other games. But yeah, I think just continuing to ask them, like Stochastic Agency said, what's that look like? Oh, I use my perception. I'll say, well, how do you use your perception? Or sometimes my players have kind of floated the, oh, do I have any, sense of them lying or something? I'll say, well, what are you looking for? Like, what is your, like, how are you determining whether they're lying or telling the truth? And if they can come up with something like, oh, I'm checking to see if they keep eye contact or something else, then I'll try to give them a clue. But if they just say, oh, I just want to know, then it's like, well, you gotta give me something. Tell me how you know, or tell me how you're trying to know. Mario Smith says, what button do I press to jump? What roll do I make to jump? I think it's just so common in the video gaming world at large to have a programmed button that the player presses and has a result. I guess, but I mean, that's kind of just like I jump, right? Because just in a video game, sometimes like in a platformer, let's say, the first time you play Mario Brothers and you get to a jump, you get to a gap between blocks, you just try to jump and make it or you don't, and then you kind of figure out whether you can make it or not. So to me, the jump button is just, I say I jump, and then you jump. I think the thing is that that versus the skill, because the one thing the skill gives you, whether who knows whether, not trying to say whether it's good or bad, but the skill does give you a sense of how good you are at it. I have a 15 in jump, means I have a pretty good jumping sense. Whereas without them, you're kind of, unless you need that help, you need that dialogue with the GM for you to say, okay, coming to the edge of the moat. How far is it? How far is it across? It looks to be between 5 and 7 feet. And then saying, okay, do I think I can jump that? And then maybe the GM, then you have to kind of have that dialogue. Well, I don't know. Maybe the GM might say, well, what's your strength? Oh, my strength's 15. Oh, yeah, I think you got a pretty good chance of making. And then maybe you'll say as a GM, because basically if you try to make it, I'm going to make it you'll have to roll under your strength, but you'll have a +2 added to the roll, make it a little bit more difficult. And then the guy goes, okay, so that means I got to roll under a 13, or I got to roll over I got to roll under a 13 to get it. And the GM goes, yep. So you go, okay, well, I think 13 still means I got a above average chances. Rolling a 20-sided die, I think 10 or 11 is the average, or 10.5. So, all right, 10.5 out of 13, whatever that gives me, great. I think I'll try that. Or say their strength is only 8, so I got to roll under 6 or 5. Like, ooh, not feeling too good. That's like a 10% chance. Yeah, I'll probably need to figure something else out. So it just changes things. But I think that concept, it's just that concept of I can get it off my sheet versus I gotta figure it out. There's always that you have to look at your sheet, but I think it's that just relying on the skill, the fact that you have it versus trying to figure something out with the environment and just interact with it, I think is the kind of the big thing. Because at some point you kind of are looking at your sheet. It's just how much you're looking at a sheet versus how much you're doing kind of Q&A, actual dialogue about the world. Ooh, there's a lot of comments in here. All right, let me see some else. So Brian Smith says, players carry that idea into tabletop RPGs, which skill has which result when it's actually a variable outcome. Yes, that is true. Stupid Dog says, maybe you could let the max level for a magic user be 10 and let them level another class like sorcerer or cleric. Yeah, though I guess there's always that point where, depending on your system, this sort of advancement devolves into like just a handful of little increases each time, which is kind of their hint to like, hey, maybe you should do something else. You could certainly do that, have some kind of multi-classing. I mean, certainly people are doing that, I think, with demi-humans, depending on the version of the game, or you could kind of max out. Like, I think like you could, they could max out certain classes, but could always level in thief. I think, like, I forget, was that in AD&D dwarves or whatever? They could only go up to such a level in fighters, but they could always keep going as thief. Things like that. Perkins says D&D's Vancian style of magic is weird for everyone the first time. Adding a non-standard magic system helps create unique PCs and events. I think that's probably true. P. Giant says 5th edition hinders players a lot of the time because they think the character sheet is only what they can do. Yeah, I think that's that thing of like, oh, I don't have that, so I can't do it. And yeah, I think that's that kind of thing, right? I think there's like we could probably talk a whole bunch about skill systems versus occupations versus classes versus all sorts of stuff. I think there's a lot of interesting things to be said in different systems that have different strengths and weaknesses. I think there's a lot to unpack there, because I think you look at different systems, like, I don't know if people have this problem with, say, in something like Call of Cthulhu, which has tons of skills but just kind of works a bit differently. And maybe it's some of that. It'd be interesting to look at, well, why do skills maybe not have, at least in people's minds, that kind of negative effect on something like Call of Cthulhu that we feel like has in modern D&D. There's probably some really interesting discussions to be had. I'm glad folks are having a lot of really cool convo in the chat, but I'm going to try to jump back some. We're already at 46 minutes, and I have no idea how much is left in this booklet. Next up, let them manipulate the world. The focus of the game should be on creative problem solving, not brute force. So give players tools to make that appealing. When you give players tools, you give them new ways to engage with the world. Add elements that allow the players to bend the world to their will. For example, rival factions to manipulate, potions with weirdly specific effects, items that can be combined or repurposed, dungeons with shortcuts and backpack passages. I mean, that's all good stuff. I think really, this has nothing to do specifically with old school style. I think that's good advice for every style. You want to give the party the tools and also the freedom to use those tools, and then be open to it, because you can give them tools, and then if you don't allow them to use the tools, then that not only does it it's going to take the wind out of their sails in that moment. But I think it's going to make them less likely to try to think outside the box, so to speak, forward. So you want to, you want if that's the kind of behavior that you want, and I feel like as a GM, as a referee, that's the kind of behavior that you should want. Then you want to encourage it and highlight it and make it as much part of the game as you can. Good items are unique tools. A good tool doesn't only increase PC's damage or add an ability bonus. It does an odd, very specific thing that is only powerful when used cleverly. This turns every problem into a puzzle and encourages creative solutions. Examples: a rope that becomes as rigid as steel on command, a coin that lands on any result you wish when flipped, a bell that produces a sphere of silence around it. Just don't let magic items become superpowers that trivialize every challenge. Give them a downside, an interesting cost, or a chance to deplete each time it is used. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that always bums me out is when I see items and they're just have like awesome combat abilities and nothing else. Give stuff weird powers because the party, your players, they'll come up with interesting ways to use the powers. And if they really can't, then they can just sell it. They can always just sell it. But if you give things with weird powers and weird abilities and weird costs and things like that, then they will, they'll be to that point where they're kind of stuck, and then all of a sudden, like that bell, like, oh, this is happening. I can't believe it. Wait a minute, I got that bell that I thought was ridiculous, but now this one incident with the harpies song or something, this bell is perfect, and now we'll use it, and then they will feel great about it. The item, they'll feel like it, almost like they'll probably give you as the GM more credit than you probably deserve. They'll think, oh, this must have been what the bell was for. It's like you're like, yeah, I guess, sure, exactly. But it works. Don't mind the fourth wall. Don't worry about metagaming or the dissonance between what the players know and what the characters know. Favor the ingenuity of the players over strict personification of their characters. Yes, and I would agree with that. And I think to the extent that like a lot of the metagaming, you just can't help. You can't. And I think I've said this before. Oftentimes we take for granted the metagaming that we want. In other words, you go into an OSR game and the first time you play, you maybe don't buy any equipment, or you just fill like a random assortment of stuff. Then the second time you play, or then you come back to the game and you've got your 10-foot pole and you've got your spikes and you've got your hammer and your spikes, you've got your this or that, you've got your 100 feet of coiled rope, you've got all this stuff. What character you're playing? Oh, this guy is a level 0 farmhand, never left the farm until he fell into a hole and ended up here, or whatever. Like, well, how did this guy know this perfect amount of adventuring equipment? Well, they didn't. I, as a player, knew. Nobody minds that stuff. And I would just think, look, if you know, or if you think in your brain as a player, oh, hey, if I use this, it's going to ruin something, then maybe that's the negative side of metagaming to avoid. I'm going to ruin this either for myself or the other players or whatever. Then maybe not. But yeah, as a GM, change up your monsters. It's a good plan to get your monsters, change them up. Don't just stick with the same tired goblin, orc, whatever. Give them a twist, something like that to keep folks on their toes. And then, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it at all. Oh, Nightbot got Brian Smith. Boom. I don't know what he said. Brian Smith says, got your chalk, tinderbox, your pit ends, and your pitons. Yep. Now we're on to build rocks in hard places. Offer tough choices. Make the players make the players weigh risk versus reward. The deeper players go into the wilderness or dungeon, the more perilous things should become, whether because their resources are running low or because danger builds the longer they linger. Keep the players asking if it is worth pushing their luck just a little bit farther. The greatest treasures are always the hardest to reach. Risk and reward are also at the heart of combat. The PC's low health is meant to push combat quickly toward the point where the players ask themselves, should I retreat to fight another day, or do I risk it all to finish them now? The thrill of that choice is at the heart of combat. Look for situations where all obvious choices come with heavy cost. These situations encourage unorthodox solutions and lateral thinking. I would agree. I would just say the one caveat to some of this is you can end up in analysis paralysis land. So just make sure if everything becomes like a super difficult, horrible choice, then there's a chance that your party is just going to get bogged down and won't be able to decide. So know your party a little bit. It's good to kind of raise the tension, but maybe, not everything has to be amped up to 11. Have some different levels. Not to say there shouldn't be some of the difficulties with every choice, but just know that some people are just going to get stuck, because if everything seems like the impossible choice, the whole situation is just going to feel impossible, and they're just going to want to break down and just sit in the corner and weep. Nightbot. It was Brian Smith. It was Nightbot. I believe Nightbot, did kill your emojis. Perkins says, my players once complained about not getting magic items. I gave them a bunch of cursed items and they didn't want to use them. I mean, you have to be careful, right? With stuff that's cursed. Because, yeah, if you give a bunch of stuff that's got all these curses attached to it, even if they have some interesting stuff, players don't generally want to have cursed items, which I can understand. So then the payoff has to be something. Maybe you can make the curses come on slowly, like the sword that it's great at killing, but every time it kills, you lose a little bit. So the player may have some other weapons they want to use, but then they need this weapon when they're fighting something hard, so they kind of be tempted. You got to kind of wait. I mean, there's the kind of cursed stuff where it's just like, haha, you got it and you're cursed. Oh no. And then there's stuff that you want to make interesting to use. You just need to kind of balance it a little bit because you have to think if these things are cursed and it's kind of either it becomes known that they're cursed or whatever. If there was, you have to make the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak. If you're going to have this curse attached to it and you want people to actually be tempted to use it, then you have to make the thing that it does well enough that people are going to be tempted. And maybe with those items, they're not tempted enough. You know, maybe you got to add a little more, sweeten it up a little bit, as they say. A belt of giant strength that turned the PC into a giant. Is that really a curse? I don't know. I might look at that and like, cool, now I'm a giant. I mean, unless, you know, giants are being hunted down to extinction or something. Doobie Dog says, I like giving player characters maximum hit points for leveling up. It's unfair any other way. I guess if fairness, if that kind of fairness is your thing, I mean, I don't have a problem with it. I mean, I've been on both sides of, I rolled really well for hit points, and then oh gosh, I rolled 1 hit point. So I wouldn't, as a player, I wouldn't hate it. I always just took it as just, well, this is part of the game, you know, kind of thing. But sure. Gashrin says, the best thing is to give items that are both useful and cursed. For example, I gave the Warlock a ring of spell storing that takes a little bit of max HP for each spell level it can store. Ooh, I like it. And the player loves it. Yeah, I think that's kind of the bargain, right? And I think that's too, because that strength, that curse or that downside doesn't affect them in their strength, right? If you have a Warlock, so they're a spellcaster, this helps them store more spells. Great. And the thing it takes away from them, yeah, it's not great to lose some of your max HP, but they're thinking that's not my deal. I shouldn't be in a situation where I'm at that close to my max HP. I should be in the back. I'm going to make sure that I can escape. So that cost now makes more sense to me as opposed to something that maybe gives them a little bit, but then maybe takes away a spell. Like, oh, you can cast a spell, but it takes away 4 of your spells. And the Warlock's thinking like, I don't want to lose my spells to gain a spell, but it works good because it kind of reinforces them. It's like, yeah, I got to play this certain way, which is kind of what I want to play anyway. And hopefully I can roll the dice on this hurting me, kind of thing. Snoopy Dog says, I don't think players should be killed by a rat. Sorry. Hey, it's all it's all a stylistic thing. I had a player that died to a little spider bite, and it actually turned into a really fun kind of plot element in the game. But you know, I don't blame you. I try to always posit them as kind of giant rats, kind of sort of not necessarily ROUS sized particularly, but sort of not just, you know, you're not a, say, New York City street rat, though they seem huge to us. You know, they're not that big. But I do think that having those things be dangerous at low levels just enforces the fact that you're not some kind of superhero. You're a normal guy, and under the right circumstances, a normal person could be killed by an ROUS or something of moderate size. A dog or small dog-sized creature could conceivably kill a normal person under the right circumstances. Brian Smith says, rats the size of beagles. Yeah, something like that. All right, subvert their expectations. It's inevitable that players will have knowledge about common fantasy elements from pop culture. Inject common monsters, locations, situations with your own unique twists. Surprise them. This encourages players to explore these differences and solve new problems they aren't familiar with. Yep, it also means that they can't take too much advantage of, oh, I know how this thing works. It's like, well, you might know, or you might be a little bit off. Now you get to take your chances. Build challenges with multiple answers. Avoid singular choke points to progress. Give them obvious, equally but differently difficult alternatives. You could also keep an extra option in your pocket that they have to dig for. Maybe it's obscure but preferable. Maybe it's just as difficult but more beneficial. Quote, there's a magically locked iron gate the players have to get past. How? I guess one of the NPCs has a key, and there's a potion of eat metal hidden in room 12C. When you build your adventures, seed them with challenges that you know the answer to. Maybe the player characters have a core capability to get past the challenge, or maybe you've just placed the solution somewhere else for them to find. Use these to encourage players to dig into the fiction and explore. If a challenge is critical for the continuation of the adventure, consider placing a few solutions. 3 is a good number. Yeah, the old rule of 3. I think the other thing you can do, which is good with those, is to also have an alternate that's maybe worse. So, okay, the magic gate. All right, you can eat metal. Maybe there's a dispel magic scroll somewhere, or maybe the party has dispel magic that they can use to get the gate to unlock or knock or something like that. And you can have the key somewhere, but then you can also have, oh, here's another way in through through this passage, but that one is maybe more harrowing. So you can find it, you dig around for it, you can find it. It might be more difficult, might take you directly to a more difficult part of the dungeon, a deeper part, which may be good, maybe bad, but they have their options. So if they don't find that hidden treasure, that hidden potion, or they don't find the NPC with the key, or whatever, something happens with that, it doesn't work out, then there's always like, okay, let's look around the perimeter. Oh, we'll find this other, say, sewer entrance or something, whatever. Oh, okay, we can try to get in there. It's not the way we wanted to get in, but we can get in. Frederick Ork says, I made players have to eat fake creatures to get magic points back at one time. That's kind of cool. Frederick also says, Tabasco sauce goes on everything. Absolutely. And then the flip side of this is, and challenges with no answer. Trust in your players. Let them surprise you and find answers to problems that you couldn't expect and can't help them with. These can be the most rewarding challenges. The deeps are stalked by a living maelstrom of ravenous psychic energy. The players want to get the golden falcon. They'll have to get past it, but I have no idea how they'll manage that. These exist to force players to be creative in ways that surprise everyone at the table. Be cautious with placing these as challenges critical for the continuation of the adventure, unless you intend for players to retreat and come back later, but sprinkling them around can surprise everyone at your table. Yep, I agree. And I think the thing is is not make them impossible, but maybe make them undesirable and highly improbable. Like, great, you can fight these 50 men to get through the door. Well, it's possible you could defeat 50 men. Highly unlikely, but it's possible. Or you could try to, figure out some other things. Like with the maelstrom, maybe you can outrun it somehow, or maybe you could you can watch it swing back and forth and try to time your run and then run, or something like that. And it's highly unlikely you'll make it, but you could make it. Of course, it'd be a lot better if you figured out how to turn off the maelstrom, or subvert your psychic energies or something, so it doesn't affect you, or blah 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 blah. Oh, Terrence asks, is that what Link's been doing all these years? Oh, with the fairies? Oh, so sad. Stupid Dog says, I like the 3.5 rules for distributing stats like strength, dex, and WizCon and charisma. I don't have a problem with the distribution stuff. I guess I just kind of default to 3d6 down the line, because I just like the fact that you've got these just kind of random dudes, and then you just sort of figure out, like, can I survive with this guy? And that is part of that sort of challenge of, boy, this guy has terrible stats, but can they survive? Or do I just, throw them at the first challenge and then roll up somebody new? Dice with death. Deadly but avoidable combat. Combat in old school RPGs is often neither balanced nor fair, and PCs should encounter foes far more powerful and numerous than they are. Players should learn to treat combat like real-world warfare and use ingenuity, preparation, and underhanded tactics to rig the results in their favor. Encourage the players to outsmart and outplan their enemies if they want to survive. Old school dungeons are usually not about being cleared of enemies. Dungeons constrain and focus possible actions. This makes it easier for both the players and the GM to identify, reason about, and plan around the problems presented. Potentially deadly combat is a common problem, one which should encourage solving in a variety of ways other than head-on. Yeah, that combat is war. If you can find a way without doing combat or ending combat early, you should definitely try. And it does sort of, once you kind of realize that, it does open, I think it opens your mind to trying to come up with other solutions. You're not just running forward into stuff. Ian says, I think WotC is doing all right, just letting you put those bonuses where you want. Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I think there's definitely the style of play that I think is prevalent in the 5e community. I think that's the right move for them. Keep up the pressure, whether it's through random encounter rolls when time passes, or because the dungeon is filling with sand, or because a PC will die in 10 turns from poison. Keep the players desperate and on a clock. Maintain a tension between the desire to explore and loot and the terror of remaining too long. If the players repeat attempts at a challenge, such as a lock-picking check, give them a consequence, such as a chance for wandering monsters. Do be sure to let them breathe back in town on long trips through the wilderness, or if they find a safe dungeon room. But always consider a chance for trouble, be it 1 in 6 per hour, day, week, or otherwise. Yeah, this is all, again, good advice, not necessarily old school particular, because it's not like old school was all full of ticking clocks in dungeons and other places. There exist in some modules and things, but oftentimes they didn't exist. But it's just good general advice. Since we're at the hour, I'm just going to see how much do I have left. Do I have to do this? Whoops. Let's see. What am I at here? I feel like I'm pretty close. I'm pretty close. All right, I'm going to push through. Pushing through, everybody. Pushing through. We're going into overtime. Weep, 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 weep. I need some overtime sound effects. Okay, so we got there. Let the dice kill them. Remember, the GM is not an antagonist to the players, but their survival is on them. If the rules and dice say that someone is dead, they're dead. Protecting the PCs from death can result in games that lack tension and players who only solve problems with brute force. Unambiguous character death gives weight to both the risks and rewards of play. Character creation is simple and quick in these games for a reason, and if they have hirelings or retainers, they have instant replacement characters. And don't worry about players not feeling attached to simple characters. They will after gaining something to lose. I think that last part's really simple that I think I mentioned in the past, but you gain your attachment kind of like you're building your backstory first through those early levels of the game. No, you're not necessarily attached to your first level fighter. You just got them. You rolled them up in 5 minutes. You gave them a goofy name, and now they're just out there. But once they start surviving a couple adventures, once they gain a couple levels, once they've gotten some stuff, suddenly now you've got that attachment, but now you also potentially have more resources to deal with it, not just you're more survivable in terms of your hit points and your armor and your equipment, but you might have the coin to get some kind of resuscitation if you need it. You may have, now you've got allies, things like that, right? You kind of build up the things that actually help you survive more in those middle levels when you've actually had a chance to play enough with a particular character to grow attached to them. So let the dice kill them, but telegraph lethality. Give players the chance to think their way around threats and obstacles by telegraphing them ahead of time. No one likes their death to be random chance. When a PC dies, it should be their fault, or at least they should know why. Be their world. Reveal the situation. Don't hide important information from the players. If the PC could reasonably know something, tell the player and move on. The game is about making decisions, and players can't make good decisions without good information. The players will be probing your vision of this place for useful information. Put your mind into that world, explore, and bring back what's valuable. Likewise, apply a real-world logic to populations and challenges rather than building a carefully balanced sequence of fights. Assume the characters have common sense and mention potential danger when it becomes obvious. Don't make them plummet from a 50-foot cliff because the player said they would hop down it. They may have heard 5 instead of 50. Yeah, this is always that kind of, that part is that are you sure? And then sort of reset, right? If you see the players are not understanding the situation or they're clearly acting in a way that would indicate that they misunderstand, then you don't just have them go about it and say, haha, this is going to be funny when they hop off that cliff and realize it's 50 feet. It's like, no, they would see the bottom, right? Just reiterate, hey, let me just make sure you know where you are, because a lot of stuff can be lost in translation. Number one, sometimes you think you've said something when you didn't. Oh, didn't I tell you that was 50 feet? Oh, my bad. And 3, sometimes we forget that we see everything in our heads because we know all the information. They don't. So err on the side of being generous with your information and your setup and whatever you're revealing and all that stuff, because we may think something's obvious because we know everything. They don't, and we have to remember that separation. What we think we said, what we think they know is not necessarily what they know. So instead of assuming that, prompt them for the follow-up question, or just restate the situation, or if it seems like they're doing something that you think doesn't really make sense and that you think they probably would not do if they understood, then they probably don't understand. So, take a time out or step back a second and give it to them. So Casting Angel says, context is king. Exactly. Brian Smith says, they're reading these and imagining it's general relationship advice. Probably would work pretty well in that regard. Give them layers to peel. What are the PCs aware of already? What did they notice at their first glance? Which of those first glance things hides information revealed in closer inspection? How would players get that information? What's obvious, what's subtle, what's hidden, and what's invisible? Create layers of information for the players to peel back and explore. Some adventure modules indicate what would be obvious to a character to help you parse these layers. If that's not the case, take care not to blurt out the secrets in a list of contents of a room. Yeah, I do like when the layout of information in a module or adventure or a dungeon, whatever, will kind of help me to figure out what is what is known at first glance versus what is you have to kind of do more investigation to figure out. Because that will happen where you'll kind of be running down a thing and go, oh, and there's a key. Oh, the keys in the desk drawer. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, great, we'll go to this desk drawer. Don't bury the lead. Keep details of your world gameable. Players should be able to act on the information you're telling them. Her eyes are a shifting mottled green, helps players remember the NPC, sure, and you notice she never stands more than one long step away from the table and its contents, gives them information they can act on. The pillars are ornately carved marble. The furthest one is crossed with a lattice work of cracks. Your details should allow players to make informed decisions and take effective action. You can hide these details within your layered environments for players to discover, but remember to make them matter. So I think the idea is that when you're giving out these details and you're giving them things right there, things that are interesting, not only interesting, but are actionable. Oh, this pillar is potentially cracked. Maybe I have a maul. If I hit it with the maul, maybe it'll break, something will happen. Or, oh, this NPC standing really close to the table. They don't leave it. There must be something valuable on the table. That kind of thing. Ray LC says, Stephen Lumpkin, one of these authors, ran a really cool West Marches campaign on roleplay back in the day. He's a cool GM, also worked on a video game Forbidden West. Oh, cool. I'll have to check that. I've seen his stuff come across my feed, Ray LC, but so I'll have to look back and try to find that. Let unknown mysteries become known problems. Maintaining secret lore can be fun, but until it's a problem for the players, it doesn't exist. Tie lore and mysteries into the treasure that the players already want to acquire. I mean, that's a good thing for just lore in general. You want to tell your players lore, you want to get them to care about your lore, you have to mix it in with what they actually want to do and what they're interested in and what their goals are. Otherwise, you're just, even if you give them a ton of exposition, they're not going to hold on to it. They're not going to remember it because it is not valuable to them at that point. Casting Agency says, that's why I love the necrotic gnome layouts, descriptions, and design. Yep, those are very good. Keep the world alive. Old school RPGs shine with improvisation and extrapolation, not rigid plots. During the game and in between sessions, think about how the other characters and factions would respond to what the PCs are doing and develop them accordingly. Your guiding principle should be, what are the logical consequences? Give the players a stake in the world. As the game goes on, players may accumulate a lot of money from completing jobs and looting treasures. Encourage them to use this money to buy property, hire retainers, or found factions. This can open up new ways for the players to interact with the world and affect its history. Yeah, so that's that. I mean, if they're interested in such, or think about, I think the broader way to think about that, because that's definitely that kind of feeding into, hey, domain play, and you can become a big player. Not everyone's going to want to do that, but maybe think about what they do want to do, and have that discussion, and then see how that can feed into the kind of economy or the sort of things that they're doing. Because the more you get them involved with that, the more they're going to be interested in the world, the more that the details of the world are going to speak to them, and they're going to want to know them. Just kind of gets them in on the loop. That was kind of classically, that was that sort of domain play. But for folks who aren't interested in domain play, maybe see what they are interested in and see if you can find a way to get that into that sort of feedback loop. NPCs aren't scripts. Give NPCs a motivation or concern that doesn't involve the PCs. This lends them some depth and grounding, as well as giving the PCs a lever to pull if they can find it. Treat NPCs like real people. Think about what the NPCs want, especially in combat. NPCs want to stay alive and will rarely start fights that they don't have a high chance of winning. Only fanatical NPCs will fight to the death. Also try to retreat or surrender if they are losing. Also remember that enemies and allies can be made to switch sides if given the right motivation. Use reaction rolls and morale rolls liberally. Reaction rolls provide more variety to encounters and demonstrate that combat isn't always assumed. Morale rolls encourage battles to end before becoming a slog or a slaughter. All true advice. And particularly with NPCs, give them different moods. Don't make them all grouchy and mean. Or if they are going to be grouchy and mean, make them grouchy and mean with a reason that maybe the PCs can discover. There's nothing more annoying than when you're in the town and like every NPC is just against you and hates you. That kind of like all the people in this town hate outsiders. Well, maybe. But how about they not? Or how about they give us a way to prove ourselves so they don't always hate us and don't make it going through too many hoops? Maybe there's some people who are friendly and nice, and then give them. I mean, part of that is, their goals aren't just be mean. They have things that they want, and then that's something the PCs can discover and again use. And I love reaction rolls, morale rolls. I need no encouragement to use them liberally, as they say. You should do likewise, folks. Doobie Dog says, you should be able to tweak game worlds such as the world of Greyhawk to fit your playstyle. I think folks are doing that all the time. I don't know that I think, like Stochastic Agency says, like, no, I don't know if anyone said they couldn't. Even with Forgotten Realms, people do all kinds of stuff. I think the nice thing about those settings is for the folks who don't want to do that, they have a lot of it down. For those who want to, they can and often do, and placing all kinds of different things in different places and changing up the histories of what happened. Uh, I mean, back in the day, I don't recall that being a thing, and I don't think now either that these pre-built settings have to be a certain way across the board. I think they're always been open to making them your own, so to speak. Here we go. Old school principles for players. Learn when to run. Old school adventures often present deadly encounters that, to the eye of a modern gamer, may seem like you're expected to beat them. Learn to dig into the fiction to see the relative power of what you're facing, and don't be afraid to cut your losses. A party that drags away one dead body is a party on their way to a cleric, instead of on their way through a monster's digestive system. This is true. Don't be afraid. If you're a player, definitely tell your players, and I would definitely say tell your players these things. Probably the biggest thing I had to tell my players, and they really got it quick, was, don't be afraid to run away. Combat as war, not sport. Don't expect encounters to be balanced. Approach combat with as much trepidation and preparation as you would in real life. Nor are encounters self-contained. Think outside the box, outside the encounter area, outside the dungeon. Think like Sun Tzu, think laterally, or die. I think that's also great advice. Don't be limited by your character sheet. Rules and mechanics are only triggered by what happens as established in the conversational fiction of play. Do something, describe your character doing it. If you need to roll dice, the GM will let you know. When presented with a problem, don't expect to use your character skills or abilities on it. Investigate it by asking the GM questions and describing what your character tries. Don't worry much about low stats or role-playing to match them. If they're low, it just means you'll have to be clever, gather information, and plan ahead to avoid dangerous rolls. Or forge ahead, foolhardy, and look forward to rolling up a new character. Just try not to drag the rest of your party down with you. It's only polite. Yep. I mean, I've said this before. You should, as a player, especially in an old school type game, you should be avoiding rolling the dice as much as possible. Live your backstory. Don't put much work into a backstory for your characters. Their experiences in play will be more real to you and your friends than anything you write. An early death won't sting quite as much, and the survivor will have real tales to tell and experience to take pride in. Yeah, and plus anything that you do is earned. If your character does it in the game, you earned it. Good, bad, heroic, cowardly, funny, whatever. It's in your backstory, sure, but saying like, "Oh, I'm the fallen hidden prince, that's the son of a god," and this, okay, but none of that was. You didn't actually do anything to get any of that. You gave that to yourself, and fine. But and I get some people love that stuff, and I'm not trying to say it's bad, wrong, fun, but just think about it in terms, especially in the kind of old school way, is think about it like you were going to create your story now, not kind of live to fulfill something that was written down on paper. Power is earned, heroism proven. Unlike many modern RPGs, your character starts with little power. Your meager means and abilities at first level encourage lateral thinking to get you out of trouble. Rising to a challenge or fleeing it means more when their life is on the line. Likewise, if you wish to play a true hero, don't expect anyone to salute you when you first ride into town. Prove your heroism through your character's actions. Yeah, my party definitely tried to be the hero maybe before they became the heroes, but it was fun. It happened to fun effect. Scrutinize the world, interrogate the fiction. Discard any assumptions about other fantasy worlds and be curious about the one you're playing in. Pay attention to details about characters, the environment, social situations, and more. Take notes on them. Make maps of them. Information is leverage, my crafty friend. Those details can save your life. If you were in a room with a heavy vase in one corner and you wanted to know what was behind it, what would you do? Probably drag it to the side, right? Looking for an air current, lick a finger and hold it up. Judging the slope of a floor, spill a little water on the ground. Engage the fiction of the game world as real. Describe the real actions you take to achieve the effect you're looking for. Remember, other games may have dice rolls to do this for you. Many old school games don't, so engage. All good advice. The only dead end is death. That dead end hallway may hide a secret door, or maybe there's another passage to investigate. The gargantuan monstrosity in the courtyard, maybe you can get around it or negotiate. A recalcitrant noble, maybe someone knows how to get some leverage. Couldn't pick that iron door, maybe one of those unidentified potions will help. Old school games have lots of hard blockers. When your first attempt fails, change tactics. The dead end is just the beginning of your solution. Often digging into the fiction and engaging the world as real will open up new and unexpected avenues. Play to win, save or loss. Everyone wants to succeed, and certainly everyone wants to play with friends they feel are aiming to succeed. But that may not always happen. Your characters may get turned into frog people, lose limbs, be stricken by leprosy, turned into stone, cursed to burp up slugs, entombed in the earth for 10,000 years, or just die from being stabbed in the gut by a farmer with a pitchfork. Learn to love the disgusting, horrifying, shocking, surprising, and even disappointing ways your characters are set back. And remember, through play, a story emerges larger than any one character. You will make your mark on the world, be it in an unknowingly misleading arrow scratched in a dungeon wall or a crater where a city once stood. And that, I believe, is the end. Snoopy Dog says, how about doing a reading of Ravenloft Night of the Walking Dead for Halloween? Yeah, I could do that. I mean, I think I did that a couple of years ago when I did Ravenloft Prime. I think I did it for Halloween. What day is Halloween this year? I would certainly potentially do that one. Terrence says, as the son of a hidden god prince, I too object to PC stealing my valor. Yes. So that was Principia Apocrypha. So I think it's really, so a couple things here, right? So people will point this and say, hey, this is OSR. It is and it's not. I mean, there's a lot of good advice in here if you're interested in the OSR from a player and a GM perspective. The document itself doesn't claim to be the defining document of the OSR. And in fact, inside it tries to give one definition of potentially what old school gaming was, and even then it says that it's something that is not necessarily agreed upon. There are many other versions, but I think in terms of does this do a good job of giving some principles of play that work particularly well? Because I think a lot of the principles aren't particularly old school. Some of them are old school. I think there's definitely a mix of old school and then more, say, modern wisdom or wisdom from other sources. You can definitely see the influences of things like Apocalypse World or the Powered by the Apocalypse type games and other things in here. But does this guidance work for GMs who wish to play in an old school style, or maybe at least the modern take of an idealized old school style? Absolutely. I think the stuff in the end for players was also good. I think it's a very interesting document, and it was fun to read it again. Hope you guys got some usage out of it. If you had run across the name of this document, hadn't seen it before, give it a read. There's links in the show description for that. On your way out, if you give a thumbs up, that'll be awesome. And if you like this and you not subscribe to the channel, you feel like subscribing, that would also be awesome. Stochastic Agency says, I've always thought this text was fairly solid overall. It's very solid. Absolutely. I can see, and like I had looked at this ages ago, and now coming back to it, I can definitely see why it continues to get recommended to read, even though it's not necessarily new and trailblazing content at this point, because it does lay it out very, very solidly, right? In terms of what I think a lot of people, when they're looking for what is GMing and what are the kind of things that a GM in the sort of old school sense and our kind of modern idealized OSR sense are doing. Well, here I do think they do a good job laying it out. The stuff for players, someone mentioned earlier, send this to your players. Yeah, I would send them both the GM part and the player part and let them kind of get the full grasp of what's going on. In terms of like the old school, like I've kind of hammered in a little bit, but it's going to be like your mouse my variant. I think that's one of the things that's interesting with the OSR is that this document presents kind of the OSR as sort of an idealized version of one version of kind of old school play. It's not everything. And I think some folks who played back in the day will look at some of the advice in here and say, we didn't do that. Our games weren't like that. But, just in terms of kind of what we've taken back, maybe what we've considered to be the things of highest, of greatest value of the old school, and then sort of brought them forward and cleaned them up and tuned them a bit. And that a version of that is what this document is kind of giving you in terms of that GM advice and that player advice. Rail C says, this has been out for a long time. What was the publish date? I don't know exactly, but I believe it's 2017 is what I saw. I don't think there are any dates given in here itself, but I believe 2017. Let's see. No, it doesn't say. But I think it might have been an RPG Geek. It said 2017. Perkins says, thanks for the review. You're welcome. You are welcome, Perkins, and everybody else. Randall C says they liked it and reinvigorated their interest after losing faith in D&D Next 5th edition for not being what I was looking for. Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of people who came to the OSR from there, and this is really a good distillation of what makes this kind of play different, say, than 5th edition gaming. I mean, at some points, I think some of the stuff carries over regardless of what kind of game you're playing, and some of it has more of the again, this is kind of how one branch of idealized old school play that we're trying to, that OSR has been about bringing back is. So it's kind of a combination of just great overall advice and then kind of some sort of primer. Stupid Dog says, thanks. I'm the best GM. No, I'm not, but I do what I can. I'll let my players answer for that, who shall never be named, so that I don't have to they don't have to lie on my behalf. Eric Wilson says, thanks for the read through. I somehow missed this resource. I think me and my group will get a lot out of this one. Cool. I'm glad I could resurface it for some folks. If you're on YouTube, or you can go to YouTube or go to forums.hex.press and look up this show, you'll see it linked in either of those spots if you happen to be getting this through Twitter or somewhere else. All right, folks, I got to run. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. Game on, and I'll talk to you later. Bye all.